This is the first opportunity I've had to address the House since the terrible events of 22nd February, and may I please at the outset take this opportunity both to extend on behalf again of our caucus our sincere condolences and our heartfelt support to the people and families and businesses of Christchurch. And Mr. Speaker, we are making every attempt to keep the tone of our interventions in keeping with this sad time, but there are real issues in this debate which are made more pressing, not less pressing, by the events of the Canterbury earthquake, and so it is appropriate to deal with them in this context. Mr. Speaker, I wish it were true, the words of the Minister of Finance who's just returned to his seat somewhere else, Mr. Speaker, which is that everybody in the country was going through the same thing. And it's not, sir, the case, because some people in this country have been suffering more than others, and that is part of the problem. Of course the people of Canterbury have suffered the most of all, and our hearts are with them and our resources will be behind them. But that's not the only terrible unfairness that's going on at the moment, because some people in this country have had massive tax cuts, and some people in this country have benefited from record export prices. And other people, sir, get stressed and depressed every time they go to fill up the petrol tank in the car or get a trolley load of groceries at the supermarket, sir, because their incomes have not risen for several years. They've gone backwards in real terms. They're struggling to feed their families in the face of ever-rising prices and a higher and higher cost of living. And we are getting two New Zealands, Mr. Speaker, not one. Under national, New Zealand is going backwards because they do not have a plan to get our whole economy going and lift all boats. And they, sir, are terribly out of touch with ordinary New Zealanders. Those ministers got their big tax cuts, each better than $240 a week. $240 a week. Someone on the minimum wage got 25 cents an hour. 25 cents an hour in the latest adjustment to the minimum wage. There's nothing fair about that. Someone earning $1 million a year got $1,000 a week back in tax, and the country had to borrow an extra billion a year to fund it. Billion over 4 years to fund it. And in the process, sir, the government has been mortgaging our children's future. Not only have they cut funding for research and innovation, but they've refused to contribute to the New Zealand Superannuation Fund, ironically about the only asset that's driving the government's books back towards balance at a very difficult time, up $3.7 billion, the very fund that the government refused to pay into. They are stealing from tomorrow to make short-term tax cuts for people that don't need them today. And, sir, that's not right. That's just not right. It wasn't right before the earthquake, and it's certainly not right now. Before going into the symptoms and the causes of those problems, can I just again note the double talk that we're getting from the Minister of Finance about the legacy the government inherited. He said in December, he himself said, in December 2008, that the Crown's books were, quote, left in reasonable shape, that the Labour government has saved for a rainy day. What did reasonable shape mean, Mr. Speaker? It meant we were in credit to the tune of 4.7% of GDP by the time you took the assets of the super fund into account. Net credit. We have a net debit now above 20% of GDP and rising, but that is on the current government's watch, not the previous government's. So let's be very clear about the historical legacy, and if the Minister was being fair in December 2008, why can't he continue to be fair about it now? Of course we regret the events that have happened to the country beyond anybody's control, and we must pull together to address them. But the way to do that is to have a plan that provides a way forward for all New Zealanders and not just some. Because National is not working for every New Zealander's family and every New Zealander's future. And Labour will give New Zealanders a fair go and make sure that everybody pays their fair share. We will protect the assets that have been built up by generations for our future, for our children. Mr. Speaker, the raw truth is that the New Zealand economy was going backwards well before the earthquake hit. The budget policy statement shows that even before the earthquake, the economy was heading in the wrong direction. In the third quarter of 2010, growth was minus 2%. We checked with Treasury this morning. Their latest estimate is growth in the fourth quarter was 0%, if not negative. And everybody is now saying that the first 2 quarters at least, probably most of 2011, will be negative. We are in another recession. And this is not the global financial crisis recession, this is Nationals' recession. They have been in power, Mr. Speaker, for 2.5 years, and they are solely responsible for the policy framework that has driven us backwards. What is the essential error in their plan? Well, firstly, they don't have a plan. Secondly, such actions as they have taken from some who couldn't afford to give and given to others who didn't need to get, Mr. Speaker, and borrowed to the proceeds. And, Mr. Speaker, that brings us to the great debt deception that has been exposed by the earthquake. The government said in its policy statement that this debate reviews that the country's international debt was so high that it was going to have to cut new spending from 1.2 billion to 0.8 billion in order to balance the books. That government debt was the problem, and that flies in the face, sir, of the truth, which is that 90% of New Zealand's high international debt was not government debt, it was private debt. Private debt that was built up by people borrowing to bid up each other's house prices and make their banker rich. Bankers like the Prime Minister. Borrowing for housing speculation made this country at risk. And when that was happening, what was Bill English saying? He's an expert on housing. He was saying tax cuts. Now that would have inflated the bubble more, and it would have prevented us building up a government surplus for the rainy day, which he at least had the grace to acknowledge in December 2008. So if we had followed his advice then, we would be in a worse position now, with less in the kitty to fund the earthquake and less to cushion us from growing international debt. But the second part of the debt deception is this, Mr. Speaker. If it was a priority on the 21st of February to cut government services and maintain tax cuts in order to pay down debt, why is it that after the earthquake the whole cost can be put onto international debt, and that once again those who could afford to spread the cost are immune? Why is it that the wealthier New Zealanders, those on very high incomes, who got the bulk of the windfall in the 2009 and 2010 budget tax cuts, are immune from any revision of the tax rates that would help spread the cost? Why is it that it's now okay to put what we can't save straight onto international debt, which was the very thing a month ago that the Minister was railing against, even though it would mean fewer doctors, fewer nurses, fewer policemen, fewer firemen, fewer people who would be there in the process? And what did he say to the Finance Committee? He said to public servants, "Don't dish up waffle, go and find a new job." Those were his words, and they were precisely the same public servants who've come up trumps in the response to this tragedy. Where would we be without a professional public service with the very people that this government was running into the ground to fund its tax cuts? Sir, it is a great, great shame that it's taken something as tragic as the Christchurch earthquake to prove the untruth, that it was all the government's fault. It was never the government's fault. It was 90% private debt because everybody in New Zealand, you and me included, borrowed to bid up house prices and built up private debt. That was the folly. And yes, New Zealand's paying for it. But the solution to that... Oh, well, there you go. There you go. Well, the solution to that is not to run the economy down by cutting the government's budget to the point where it cannot be a force for good.
The member's time has expired.